Yes, ladies and gentlemen, thank you once again for joining us for this latest episode of INC Live, and we are doing the preview show for UFC 269. My name is Karl Bainbridge in a pitch black northeast of England, and I am joined by somebody who thankfully has a lot more sunshine than we do. It's John Martian MMA. John, thank you very much for joining us.
What's up, Karl? What's up, INC Live? Yep, it's nice and sunny here in Pennsylvania. We're coming off a great UFC event last night, and we got ourselves a great pay-per-view this weekend. I mean, a great pay-per-view because there's a lot of good cards in this, or a lot of good fights on this card, and I can't wait to talk about them with Karl here in a second.
And I have to say as well, John, happy anniversary. It's 4 years to the day since you first started doing your first ever preview show, which I think was UFC 218, I believe.
Yep. Infamously violent card, very memorable card. But yeah, started the podcast over 4 years ago and done a podcast before every single UFC event. So you know how you and Karl and I do these preview shows before pay-per-views? Well, I've done one before every single fight night pay-per-view for the past 4 years in a row. So an achievement I'm very proud of.
Have you ever dared listen back to the first episode you've done?
Oh, hell no. It probably sounds terrible. I mean, I just hit record with, saying, and there's no point in re-listening to that.
If it makes you feel better, when we did our first ever preview show, we just had a webcam in the corner of the room, and it was just me and a group of friends talking, like no editing, nothing like that. So
probably awful, yeah.
That's going to make you feel a bit better, but I wasn't going to turn down the opportunity to talk about Raquel Pennington's only pay-per-view main event.
Right. And bad news for you. Is she out of... No. What's her face is out of her fight. Avila is out of her fight in 2 weeks.
Out.
So
they're trying to look for a replacement. I know Sarah Kaufman's desperate for that fight.
Yeah. Well, we got to keep your girl Rocky Pennington on the card, man.
Let's certainly hope so. And if there are people out there, John, who do want to see any of your previews in more detail, where is the best place for them to go?
You can find me at Martian MMA on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, SoundCloud. You can subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts to get it on the mobile devices. You can listen to YouTube, SoundCloud, wherever. Find me on Twitter, UFO_UFC.
Certainly so. And I have to say, John does an absolutely fantastic job breaking down every card and going into a lot of detail as well when it comes to the bookie side of things. So if you do want to know where you can get some value for money, John is the best person to speak to. So the big question is, John, where was the big money from last night's card? Rob Font versus Jose Aldo. We're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail before we get on to 269. And a lot of people already had Jose Aldo down as a first ballot UFC Hall of Famer. I think he confirmed his place once again with a fantastic performance.
Oh, yeah. I mean, no doubt about it. What we saw last night was just unexplainable. I mean, for Jose Aldo to be competing at this level of MMA this late into his career, he went pro 17 years ago. He started in the WEC 13 years ago, and he's essentially been fighting at the highest level of the sport for 13 years. He's at a new weight class. He suffered some tough losses to Holloway, to Connor, to Volkanovski. He reinvented himself at this 135-pound weight class, and he's knocking off great opponents. Marlon Vera, Pedro Munoz, Rob Font over 5 rounds. And, I mean, Font looked sharp last night. He had the right approach. He came at Aldo early. He made him uncomfortable, and Aldo still adapted, still rocked him, still took him down, still outgrappled him, outstruck him over 5 rounds. I mean, it was just a masterclass 5-round performance, veteran lesson, and it just solidified why Jose Aldo is the best fighter of all time. We got my Jose Aldo shirt still on from last night. Probably won't take it off for a few weeks or something like that. And I'm just grateful for Jose Aldo. Grateful to witness him fight, and it was just amazing to watch him last night.
I think the way that the fans have reclaimed Jose Aldo as one of their own, I think has been something which I've been very impressed to see, because a lot of people forget this with Jose Aldo. You go back and you watch some of his early title defenses. He received a lot of criticism at times for maybe being a bit too conservative, a bit too safe. Then, of course, what happened against Conor happened. But I think those sort of like pure hardcore fans who followed the sport since the WEC days have really started to rally and say, no, this guy is a top-class, great fighter. And we're starting to see that rub off on a lot more of the casual fans, I would say.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I think that he was a little bit underrated for a while. He went to a lot of decisions in a row. But then he got more and more high-profile fights. And I think people, sympathize with him a little bit after his losses at 145, and they're just rooting for him more and more at 135. I mean, they threw him to the wolves initially against Marias and Jan, but he still has had an amazing show for himself at this 135-pound weight class, and he just continues to add to his legacy. So I'm glad he's finally getting some of the respect and praise he deserves, because he is not only my favorite fighter of all time, but I believe he's the greatest fighter of all time.
You've actually made a really good point there. I'm sorry for jumping in, but I've had this argument with quite a few people, and I've had it with certain fighters, certain weight classes, but I think Aldo is a great case study of it. There's a big difference between being the best fighter and being the greatest. I think a lot of people equate greatness purely to portfolio, and yet you look at someone like Aldo. Yes, he has lost to Volkanovski. Yes, he has lost to Max Holloway twice, but those fighters, as good as they are, I don't think have the mystique and the legacy and the longevity as someone like Jose Aldo. So when everyone says who's the greatest featherweight of all time, I say immediately Aldo for those reasons.
Yeah, the featherweight discussion is hard to have because, I think it would be Aldo, Holloway, Volkanovski, McGregor, but then McGregor has wins over Aldo and Holloway, and Volkanovski has wins over Aldo and Holloway. So it's interesting when you have this discussion. It might be easy to think that Max and Volkanovski are the best because they have the wins, but in terms of career greatness and achievement, Aldo is still number one for me. I mean, he won another 5-round decision last night. I think that's 7-0 in 5-round decisions in the WEC UFC era. He did lose his 5-round fight to Peter Yan, but when the fight has gone the decision for the full 5 rounds, he's 7-0. It just shows, how well-rounded this guy is, how good at winning rounds he is, how experienced he is, and I just can't say enough good things about Jose Aldo. I love the guy to death.
Before we get on to 269, anyone else who stood out for you?
I mean, Fiziev looked incredible. I was, picking and rooting for Brad Riddell there, but you can't take away from how great Fiziev looked. And I know you want to talk about Chris Curtis, man. This guy's on a run lately. Dumbass Dana White passed on him back in the Contender Series several years ago. I mean, this guy made a show built to bring in contenders and prospects. And when he gets a great contender prospect on his show, and he won by finish, if I recall correctly, I think he won by head kick knockout, and they still didn't sign him. They still didn't sign him for years and years and years. And then when they needed someone on a short notice, they finally give him a contract. And then what do you know? 2 short notice fights. He knocks off 2 top 15 middleweights back to back, knocks them both out in the second round. So I mean, Chris Curtis is, like you tweeted earlier, one of the best stories in MMA right now.
6 wins in 2021. He'd been in with the PFL. He retired twice. And I think he retired after the Contender Series as well when he didn't get the contract. So 3 retirements, 6 wins in a row. It has been a fantastic story. And I hope that we can continue this come 2022, because it has been, like I tweeted before, one of the sort of feel-good stories of the year.
Yeah, I mean, and his fights are just like nonstop action too. I mean, both fights of his have been nonstop back and forth striking where he prevailed, persisted, and knocked the guy out at the end of them. So, I mean, honestly, probably one of the top debutants of the entire year, even though he came in on November. That's crazy, right? I mean, the month is 12. The year is 12 years long. Oh my God. The year is 12 months long, and he was only in the UFC for 2 of those months, and he might be one of the best debutants all year. So,
yeah. I wish we could talk a little bit more detail about Font versus Aldo, the whole fight card. We're going to be moving on to 269. Now, it is the last card of the year. And as the UFC normally seem to do, 2020 was really the only exception, and there were obviously a lot of mitigating circumstances around that. But the UFC usually go out their way to make sure the last card of the year is a stacked one. And if you look at the undercard and the main card itself, you could argue they've done the same again.
Yeah, I mean, they've done a really good job at stacking these pay-per-views. We've been a bit critical of that at times because some of the fight nights have been a bit lackluster lately, and the pay-per-view cards have been kind of overcompensating for that with like 6, 7, 8, 9 good fights on an entire card. But, there's nothing worth complaining about this week because we get to see all these great fights this week. We've already, made it through all the rough fight night cards. And now we're just, dealing with the good parts of it with this amazing pay-per-view. So the fact that Munoz and Cruz and Emmett and Ige are on the prelims just shows how high level this card is. And of course, Karl's favorite fighter in MMA, Amanda Nunes, defending her belt once again. We all cannot wait for that. Women's bantamweight, obviously one of the top divisions in MMA. Everyone is talking about it. And, I'm just so excited to see Julia Pena test Amanda Nunes. Can't wait.
I tell you what, we got a lot of people criticizing us for some of the comments we made about Rose Namajunas versus Zhang Weili. Those people aren't going to like what we have to say about this week's co-main.
Fuck them. That's what I gotta say.
I am curious to see how many pay-per-view buys this card does, because I think a lot of it's going to be built around Dustin Poirier, who's been one of the biggest stars of this year. But it's also going to be the first time that Dustin Poirier has been truly tested as a pay-per-view A-side. Like, no disrespect to Charles Oliveira, who obviously fantastic job winning the title, but I think most people are going to be going into this card for Dustin Poirier. So I'm going to be interested to see how many buys this does, because is he going to get the rub from the 2 Conor wins? Are people going to be interested in, like, obviously Charles as champion? It's quite intriguing to see.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that pay-per-view number. I'm thinking 300,000 to 400,000. There are a lot of good supporting names on the card. Nunes, Cody, O'Malley, Dom Cruz, all pretty well-known people. But I don't think any of them are the type of fighters to really draw, pay-per-views, especially Amanda Nunes, as Karl is very familiar with. So I think, maybe 500,000 would be a good number for them. But I just don't think either of these guys, as great as they are, Poirier and Oliveira, they're both great fighters, great guys. I just don't think they're going to, inspire a whole lot of unique pay-per-view buys. But, like you said, it's the end of the year. It's a great card. It might, crack 500,000, to my surprise.
I'm going to go for 500,000 as well. Before we actually get onto the main card itself, though, as you mentioned before, it's time for us to talk about the prelims. You can see those on the screen right now. I do want to stress that this card is subject to change. Obviously, we have quite a few last-minute pull-outs these days. One fight I am most interested to see, though, is going to be the prelim headliner, because for the first time in over a year, Josh Emmett is back in action. Now, the last time we saw him, he had that fantastic war against Shane Burgos, probably one of the best fights that the UFC Apex has hosted. But he hasn't got himself an easy match coming back. He's going to be taking on Danny Ige, who once again gets another opportunity to get that sort of jump up in quality. I'm going to be interested to see this, because if I had to judge 2 fully fit fighters, I would pick Josh Emmett to win this fight, because he has the big power advantage. But 36 years old, his injury was an ACL, and if you follow any kind of sport, whether that's football, soccer, basketball, you do your ACL in, it's very hit or miss on how good you are coming back. So are we going to see the same Josh Emmett in 7 days' time?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. You got to have, some skepticism over Emmett. You brought up good points, the knee surgery, and not to mention he was just in that war with Burgos too. Good thing you mentioned that. I mean, that fight against Burgos was just insane. I mean, you can see about 30 seconds into that fight, Emmett throws a leg kick and something is wrong with his knees. So he was 30 seconds into that fight against Shane Burgos, who we all know is, a nasty fighter. And for him to fight on one leg, essentially, and gut out that fight, win that decision in that competitive boxing fight, I mean, just one of the greatest displays of sheer toughness I've ever seen in MMA. So Josh Emmett deserves a lot of credit. I'm not too fond of this matchmaking, though. You got Dan Ige coming off of a main event loss against Korean Zombie, and then you're throwing him right back in there with the top 10. I mean, Dan Ige gets no easy fights. Emmett, as well, coming off of a great win, coming off of a long layoff, an injury. I would like to see them, give him maybe someone in the top 20, top 25 instead of the top 10. So I think both these guys deserve a little bit easier fights, because I don't want to see, Ige lose 2 in a row. But it's a great matchup. So I'll pass it back to you to give your prediction before I give mine, Karl.
I'm going to be leaning towards Danny Ige, simply because I am so concerned about ACL injuries because I've seen this happen before in so many sports where a guy does that in and they're not the same. Like, obviously, recently in terms of MMA, look at how much, like, Thiago Santos is a shadow of the fighter he was before the John Jones fight. And of course, that was what he did, and he did his ACL in.
Yeah, it's a good reference. I mean, good comparison. And I think Santos was 36 too, so, pretty similar age. Both are also very reliant on their explosiveness, their power. So it's going to be interesting for sure. The odds last night, I checked, and Ige was like plus 185, plus 175. He's all the way down to plus 142 now. So this typically happens right after the last UFC ends. People start looking forward to the next UFC, start putting their bets in. For instance, like last night, I bet Kai France, and his line has dropped. But a lot of money coming in on Dan Ige in the past 24 hours. And I think it's right because where the odds were initially for Ige put him at like 35% or below. I mean, that's a little bit off. I think that Emmett is the deserved favorite. You see him at around 60% now. I think that's about right because don't forget, Josh Emmett has, a decent wrestling game that he went to a lot early in his career, won most of his early fights by taking his opponents down, then kind of fell in love with his hands, started knocking people out, and he does have knockouts with both hands too. So he has right hand knockouts, left hand knockouts, a solid takedown game, and he's extremely tough. So I think that he does have a few more ways to win the fight than Ige, but I am skeptical enough about the surgery, and I respect Ige enough to say that I probably won't be betting Emmett in this one. And I think you got to take the underdog or not bet this one at all. I think Ige by decision is probably a good bet. That'll probably be around like 3-1 odds.
You mentioned the tough run of fights that Dan Ige has been having recently. It brings us on to Pedro Munoz because I've had a look at Pedro Munoz's last few fights since 2019. Cody Garbrandt, Aljamain Sterling, Frankie Edgar, Jimmy Rivera, Jose Aldo, and now he's fighting former bantamweight champion Dominic Cruz.
Yeah, I mean, another murderer's row of opponents. And, I mean, we're treating these fights like we do the main card fights because they're that good. These are, extremely elite level fights, and they deserve to be talked about a lot. So I know we usually only typically fully dive into the main card ones, but these ones are worthy. Yeah, I mean, it would be a disservice to these fights not to put it on, not to discuss it. I mean, so, I love both these guys. I mean, how could you not like both of these guys? I mean, Cruz has a little bit of, an arrogant personality, so I could see not really liking him too much, but you got to respect him as a fighter. I was talking about Aldo earlier at the top level for so long. Cruz is right up there. I mean, he isn't quite at the elite level that Aldo is, but if he were able to pick up a win over Munoz, he would be right in that discussion because, I mean, the prime of Cruz's WEC career had to have started the same thing 13, 14 years ago, and he's had his, fair share of injuries over the years. So if he were able to come back and to win a fight like Munoz, I think it would bring him to a new level in like the greatest of all time discussions because we saw him beat Casey Kenny. Kenny is a good, top 10, top 15 fighter. But Cruz was able to take Kenny down a little bit. He was able to, wear on Kenny in the clinch situations. Pedro Munoz, notoriously hard to take down, notoriously hard to hold down. He's got that nasty guillotine of his own. So, it's going to be a little more difficult for Cruz to get some of that grappling time. He's not going to be able to take breaks from the striking of Munoz because he's just such a hard guy to grapple. So I think this fight is going to be mostly striking. And you got to look at Dominic Cruz's fight against Cejudo. Cejudo chopped the legs really badly there. Munoz is known for chopping the legs. And you got to think, though, that Cruz was a little bit caught off guard by Cejudo there. Cejudo didn't typically smash the legs like that. It's not like he did it in a wealth of fights in a row. Munoz is a reliable leg kicker. Cruz is going to know what's coming. I think he's going to be a little bit better prepared for those leg kicks, but I could see him still struggling with those leg kicks and just the sheer toughness and output of Munoz. I mean, this guy is one of the most durable fighters in the history of the UFC. And his durability is still with him late into his career. The Jimmy Rivera fight proved that. He ate so many flush punches in that fight. So I'm leaning Munoz here. I'll go Munoz by decision. I think either guy is going to win this one 29-28. But, an incredible fight. I think this one deserves to be on the main card.
Why do you think they're choosing to put Dominic Cruz back on the prelims?
I don't know. I mean, you hear the narrative that the UFC likes to, stack the prelims sometimes during the pay-per-view to, I don't know, I guess inspire pay-per-view buys. But here's my thinking. If you're not already considering, or you haven't already made the decision to buy the pay-per-view at 8 p.m. on Friday or on Saturday, how many people are really watching the prelims and go, oh, I'll go over to ESPN Plus and spend $70 to watch this? I think it's an extremely minute amount of people. So putting really good fights on the prelims in hopes of buffing up the pay-per-view, I don't really believe that exists. So I personally probably would have put Ponzinibbio and Jeff Neal on the prelims and thrown Munoz and Cruz up to the main card.
Anything else on the prelims that stands out for you?
What's your pick for Munoz versus Cruz, Karl?
I'm going to pick Pedro Munoz. And I know that's a little bit surprising, but as you mentioned before, I think the leg kicks are going to cause Dominic Cruz a lot of problems, especially when a lot of Dom's success is based on how movement orientated he is. And personally, I thought Casey Kenny gave him a very, very tough fight. And I think that while we praise Aldo for obviously continuing to perform at a high level, I think we're seeing Cruz starting to slow down. Not necessarily become a bad fighter, because he's not. But we're just starting to see that sort of veteran decline that sometimes happens with a lot of great guys. It's natural. It's the circle of life.
Yeah, I do agree with that. And in terms of the rest of the prelims, one thing I'm thinking about, this is, a bit of a bad vibe comment, but a lot of Brazilians on this card. I hope, everyone is able to get in and test negative for COVID and whatnot. Hopefully everyone's vaccinated traveling internationally. But, that is a kind of a scary thing about this card. We got like 6, 7, 8 Brazilians coming from Brazil typically. And then in terms of fights, I'm looking at Erin Blanchfield versus Miranda Maverick. Both of these women are under 23, 24 years old. Seem like bright prospects in women's mixed martial arts. And I'm a big fan of Erin Blanchfield. She's a New Jersey girl, pretty close to me, and she's the underdog. I think she's the better grappler, so I'll be picking Blanchfield as a dog. What's sticking out to you, Karl?
I'm intrigued by Alex Perez versus Matt Schnell more than anything because 13 months ago, Alex Perez headlined a UFC pay-per-view. He fought Figueiredo, UFC 255. And nobody I've spoken to just seems to remember that fight actually happened. This guy headlined the pay-per-view, and here he is fighting, third and fourth fight on the card, in what I think is going to be a very entertaining match against Matt Schnell, who nearly always brings it.
Yeah, I mean, how he's fallen from main or pay-per-view main card or pay-per-view main event title fight to now, the fourth fight on the prelims. I think that kind of diminishes your own product. I mean, if your title challenger main event headliner is now on the bottom of the prelims, like, I feel like that, that shows that your product isn't the highest level. I mean, even though Perez is a good fighter, I'm excited for this fight too. I just kind of think Perez has him covered everywhere, and he should win pretty handedly.
So that's all the prelims set up, and there's plenty of fantastic fights, which obviously John will get into in a lot more detail on his own show. For now, though, we're going to be focusing on fight number 1 of our pay-per-view main card, and it's our obligatory pay-per-view main card appearance for Sean O'Malley. Before we actually get into his main event fight, where he's going to be taking on Raleigh Paiva, hope I pronounced that right, I want your opinion on the things that Sean O'Malley's been saying in the build-up to this, because after the Chris Moutinho match, which there was a lot of criticism from the UFC that rather than give him someone who was a little bit more tougher, they went for somebody on the regional scene who was arguably there to be a bit of a punching bag. And Sean O'Malley made a comment, which I'm just paraphrasing here. These weren't his exact words, but he said something along the lines of, "Why should I fight bigger names when I'm not getting paid more to do it?" And there's two sort of schools of thought. There's the sort of fight fan who wants to think, well, you want to challenge yourself, you want to test yourself against the best guys. And then there's other people who are saying, yeah, Sean, it might not be the ethical right thing to do, but you're being the smart businessman. And I do agree with you when you say, hey, if you want me, why do you want to pay me $5,000 to fight a Frankie Edgar or a Chito Vera when I could fight these guys instead.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I don't think that Sean's the smartest guy. I think a lot of the stuff he says is pretty stupid, honestly. But this is an interesting discussion. I'm glad you brought it up because he is making the smart, business decision, the right risk management decision, right? You got to think that if he's getting the same pay, you might as well take the fight with the highest probability that you have to win. But that is also going to pay, or be a detriment long term because tough matchups in your career make you a better fighter, and the more tough matchups you face, and if you're persistent, if you work on your mistakes, if you work to overcome why you lost, you can actually become a really good fighter. So I kind of think of it like the regional scene argument. So would you rather get matched up with a promotion that's going to give you 5 easy opponents, you finish all 5 of them, and you get to the UFC in 5 fights? Or would you rather go 6-3, 7-4, but actually take tough fights and face good fighters from other gyms? I would rather have the fighter who's 7-4 because I know they're gonna actually be fighting tough matchups. They're gonna be getting better, but that they're probably not gonna get in the UFC because they don't have that perfect 5-0 record. So it's a really interesting debate. Paiva I think is a big step up, but I'll pass it back to you to give your thoughts on the matchup.
Well, the alternative to Sean O'Malley is what we saw with Kevin Lee. Like, Kevin Lee took a lot of very tough matches early in his UFC run. Like, he was beating guys like Trinaldo, Mustafayev, and he got a massive buzz from that, and a lot of people were saying future UFC champion. But because he was only taking the tough matches, when the losses started rolling in, the UFC were quicker to cut him than it would have been if he took an easier path into the top 15.
Yeah, I do kind of feel bad for Kevin Lee. I think they're diluting the roster. I mean, it's pretty clear that you can get 8 contender series fighters for the cost of one, experienced veteran fighter like Kevin Lee, like Junior Dos Santos, Alistair Overeem. So, they're getting rid of a lot of those, guys that are kind of stuck in the middle. But getting back to this Paiva Malley fight, I really think that Paiva is a well-rounded fighter. I mean, I think the guy is kind of unknown amongst, a lot of fans. But his run at flyweight was good. He had his debut at 135, went through hell in round 1 versus Kyler Phillips. Sorry for a barrage of motorcycles driving by, if you can hear that. But he got knocked down, severely badly in round 1 versus Kyler Phillips. Looked to be, nearly unconscious a few times. Still managed to come back and wins round 2 and 3 of that fight. So it was a little bit the fact that Kyler gassed out, but you still got to respect the toughness, the skills of Paiva to withstand that. And I think a similar thing could happen here where O'Malley starts fast. He's landing the hands on Paiva. Paiva's not really reacting too well to the punches, but the guy's extremely durable. And I don't think O'Malley is, the biggest puncher. I mean, we've seen him tee off on guys like Terrion Ware, Chris Moutinho, and not really finish them. It took him to the round 3 to finish Thomas Almeida. So I don't think O'Malley has that one punch power like we saw in the Eddie Wineland fight. So Paiva's probably going to lose round 1 here. Going to have a tough round 1, but rounds 2 and 3 are going to get real interesting. We're going to see, O'Malley's cardio tested against a good fighter. Paiva is a solid grappler. You might see O'Malley's grappling tested. So, I don't think O'Malley is nearly good enough of a fighter to deserve being the 75% favorite here. But you'll probably also get Paiva as a better bet in the live betting. So wait around, bet Paiva, and I'll definitely be cheering for Julian Paiva here.
I do like how Paiva uses pressure. That's one of the things I have liked about him. He is a very sort of come-forward fighter, which, bearing in mind how good of a counter-striker Sean O'Malley is, that might be a bad thing. But as you mentioned before, the conditioning of Sean is going to be something which I'm going to have a keen eye on. I'm also interested. I also agree with you. I think a lot of people have framed the idea of Sean O'Malley being the sort of one-punch knockout artist who was just flatlining everyone. I do think his stock took a little bit of a hit in that regard, bearing in mind what happened against Moutinho.
Yeah, I mean, I saw Moutinho get rocked and hurt several times on the regionals, and I was expecting him to get knocked out in the first round. I really was. And with the amount of punches that Sean O'Malley landed, he should have knocked him out a lot sooner, in my opinion. Maybe Moutinho just showed up with, incredible durability or something. Durability does kind of vary like that. Sometimes you'll see a guy get knocked out early, and then the next fight they'll just show something crazy chin. But O'Malley, looking at his record, he does technically have 5 knockouts in a row. And I just think that plays into him being, 4 knockouts in a row. He lost by a knockout technically versus Vera. I just think that kind of plays into him being overrated still. I think, I know you guys aren't too interested in betting, but I mean, if O'Malley would have went to the decision against Almeida and Moutinho, would he still be, a minus 300 or more favorite here, or would the line be a little bit closer? So I'm just not really ready to consider O'Malley a legit prospect yet. I know that might seem crazy to some, but I'm telling you, this guy is not as good as the UFC wants you to think he is. Paiva is the best opponent he's fought at bantamweight so far, besides Marlon Vera. But Paiva is probably, in between 15 and 20th at bantamweight, and it's probably one of the toughest tests. So O'Malley's fought no one in the top 10. Don't let yourself get confused and think this guy is some legit proven prospect, because he's not. And I really hope that Paiva does test him this weekend.
If Paiva is going to get the victory, how do you think it's going to happen?
I think it'll be decision.
Yep. I will be picking Sean O'Malley to win this one. I'm going to say a second round finish. I do have some sort of... While Valiant Paiva is very durable, we saw that against Kyler Phillips. I just don't think that he has anything. I think the big thing that's going to hurt Sean is somebody who is a real top-level wrestler, because I do have questions about his grappling game. I also don't think that Sean is the most durable fighter. He's broken bones in, I think, 3 of his UFC fights. Obviously, there was the Sukmantar, the Chito Vera loss, and I think he broke his hand against Moutinho as well. So I think that's something that's going to be a concern. If Paiva had that sort of great wrestling game, I would maybe say take a quick punt on him. I just don't think he has that, and I do think Sean O'Malley is going to be able to... I could see him hurting him to the body. I could see like a good body kick, him keeling over, and Sean teeing off.
I'll straight up pick Paiva, so we'll have a little bit of fun to disagree on this one.
Yeah. It's going to be interesting to see. I think the UFC is still massively invested in the Sean O'Malley experiment. I mean, this is what? His 4th, 5th pay-per-view main card appearance?
Yeah, and, maybe he'll fight. I mean, I think Paiva is a good step in the right direction, but I think they could have given him someone a few steps higher to really test him. But I'm excited for this fight. And
I think people are ready for it as well. That we're starting to get into sort of MVP territory with Sean O'Malley. We're desperate for the jump in quality.
Yeah, that's a good comparison. I like that one.
Now, this is going to be an interesting fight. It's fight number 2 on our main card, and we're going down to the flyweight division. It's very rare that we see the flyweights getting showcased on the main card of a pay-per-view. And we've got ourselves a really intriguing matchup. Cody Garbrandt, after UFC 207, I think he was, 10, 11 and 0 in the UFC. This big, powerful knockout artist, a lot of charisma, a lot of personality behind him. Things haven't gone very well since then, though. He had the 2 losses to TJ Dillashaw, got knocked out against Pedro Munoz. We thought, when he knocked out a Sun Tzu, that he was back in action. Then comes the Rob Font decision. And he makes this big call, which took a lot of people by surprise. He's going to drop down to flyweight for the first time. Now, this is 2 ways that this could go. And I want your opinion before we actually get into dissecting the fight. Is this going to be TJ Dillashaw, or is this going to be Jose Aldo?
TJ. Easy.
And what is it that makes you think that?
Well, I mean, the guy has had, some chin problems at 135. It's, I guess it's more of a defense problem. It's not like he's getting dropped with weak shots. I mean, he's getting caught with big bombs, but he did get knocked out 3 fights in a row, right? So, he got dropped in those fights like twice each too. So a lot of damage in those few fights. Rob Font put a clinic on him, jabbing him up, just outstriking him overall. And I just don't understand the move to 125. I mean, I think a lot of fighters think that a move in weight class is going to solve some issues. Unless you're Jose Aldo, I don't think that's typically the right move. And Cody had a big speed advantage at 135. He's extremely quick, but moving down to 125, you're kind of giving up that speed advantage, and that's probably one of his biggest attributes as a fighter. So going down to the smaller weight class, I think he's given up some speed, and he's running into a really, really stiff test in his first fight. I really don't get the UFC matchmaking. Again, if you got this guy Cody Garbrandt, who I personally don't like as a fighter, but if I'm matching him up with someone, I'm giving him a winnable fight. Someone outside of the top 15 at flyweight. He gets a win under his belt. He gets more comfortable. You get to put him in a higher profile fight in his next fight. It's a good business strategy. But putting him in a really risky matchup against France, who has good boxing, who has knockout power, I think it's a really dangerous matchup for Cody Garbrandt.
I think what this fight is for me is it's a litmus test to see how Cody could handle 125. It's a little bit similar to when Rockhold moved up to 205 and he put him against Jan Blachowicz, which is on that sort of top number 6, number 7 range, just to basically see, is this guy good enough to be like a top 10 light heavyweight? And then obviously if he doesn't, you don't really lose anything from Rockhold's perspective because he can then go back down. And I think this is sort of what they're doing with Cody Garbrandt. I do agree with you, though, that if I wanted to try and keep the Cody Garbrandt bandwagon going, which you'd want to because he's a big charismatic knockout artist, you would give him against somebody who was maybe an easier matchup, somebody who was maybe a bit more grappling orientated. Because I'm with you, I like France. I think he's got great boxing combinations. He works the body very well. We saw that plenty of times before. Yeah, I really do like France. I think that if we saw Rob Font just jab and irritate Cody for 25 minutes in that main event early on in the year, I can easily see France doing exactly the same thing.
Yeah, and I think that I think France is not scared to exchange. He's not scared to brawl. We saw that in the Royval fight. And he's not the same methodical, technical striker that Font is. He's not going to, outstrike him, move backwards, retreat, find out the right combination. I mean, France will get in that pocket and he will throw down. And Cody Garbrandt can do that at times too. But that's where he gets really vulnerable in those exchanges. That's where we've seen him hurt multiple times at bantamweight. But France not extremely durable. We did see him get rocked by that crazy spinning elbow. We did see him taken down and get his back taken by Hojiro Bontra. We saw him have a really tough fight with Julian Paiva, who we were just talking about. So there are some vulnerabilities from France, but for this matchup, I still like him. I still will be picking him. I think that the grappling will be interesting to see here, whether Cody Garbrandt shoots a takedown. But with how scrambly these guys are at 125, with Cody not really having the best top control, I don't think Cody's going to keep Kai down for a long period of time. And I think we're just going to have some real competitive striking exchanges here. So I think this one's kind of like a coin flip, maybe even France as a slight favorite, because Cody's floor could be a lot lower than we think. I mean, he could eat 1 or 2 punches and his chin might not be the same at all, like TJ Dillashaw, like you mentioned. So Cody's floor could be a lot lower than we think. And I got a bet in on France last night. He was plus 150 last night. He's already down to plus 120 now. So the action is coming in on France as well. And I would have done France versus Alex Perez, and I would have given Matt Schnell Cody Garbrandt.
That now would be a hell of a fight. I think Schnell matches up very well with Cody Garbrandt. I'd also argue as well
that would be perfect.
I think Kai has the more diverse striking set than what Cody does, because Kai can throw in the kicks. Obviously, he's got the striking and the jab to go with it. Cody is nearly all boxing based.
Yep. Yeah, very good point.
Yeah, and as you mentioned before, I think that a guy who is notoriously chinny going down to 125, admittedly, these guys don't hit as hard as they do at 135, but that's a big concern for Cody.
Yeah, Kai's got some legit pop. I mean, watch that Bontrain fight. I mean, he he escapes that back take and 1 2 punches, and Bonter and is on Queer Street. Hilarious stoppage by Herb Dean there too.
No surprise there.
And you picking Kai France?
I am picking Kai France, and that might be a bit of a surprise to some people. Obviously, Cody Garbrandt has the bigger name. He's got the higher profile wins, but I just think there's too many concerns over Cody's chin at 125. I don't know if the power's going to translate. I think Kai is intelligent enough to try and avoid the sort of big, sort of wild brawls that Cody wants to get into. So I'm going to say Kai France by decision. If there's one concern, though, we have seen Kai get rocked a couple of times by guys who are far worse strikers than Cody Garbrandt, and that's the only concern I have. But I am picking Kai to get this one.
Nice, me too.
Now we move on to fight number 3. Now I want to add a little bit of a disclaimer because this might be very out of date by the time we put this together. We're still not 100% sure whether or not this fight is going to take place. There have been a lot of reports over some of the legal issues surrounding Jeff Neal, but at this moment in time, at the time of recording, this fight is going to be fight number 3 on the main card. It's a welterweight bout, which I think has a lot of people very intrigued. Jeff Neal is taking on Santiago Ponzinibbio. Bookmakers' odds for this one, as it stands right now, is an absolute pick, minus 110 on both sides. John, we were expecting Leon Edwards versus Jorge Masvidal. Is this a good enough replacement?
No, it's not. It's still a really good fight, but I kind of had forgotten about that until now. But yeah, Leon versus Jorge would have been really fun. It would have taken this card to a whole nother level. I think we're looking at like an A- pay-per-view here. That would have brought it up to an A+. So it's a bit unfortunate that happened, but the legal trouble you're talking about, I think it is relevant to mention. He was arrested for a DUI. I don't know what the substance was. I assume alcohol, obviously the most common. I don't know if that was officially announced or not, but it's relevant. It's relevant to bring up because if you're this was on Thanksgiving, so if you're getting drunk and drunk driving on Thanksgiving Day, 2 weeks before your fight, probably not a good sign for your preparation for the camp. When you throw that in with Jeff Neal's past 2 performances where he looked particularly uninspired, you gotta really start to question Jeff Neal here. I think that Jeff Neal really looked amazing in his early UFC run when he was fighting guys who would kind of stand in front of him and trade. Like Nico Price, like Frank Camacho, and he quickly ran into the higher level of competition where he started to struggle. I don't really blame him for the loss against Stephen Thompson because that was a really difficult matchup. Obviously, Wonder Boy is an incredible striker. Neal's only really a striker as well, so I can see why that was tough. But Neil Magny, I don't really give him too much slack for. I mean, look at the comparisons between these guys' fights against Neil Magny. I know Ponzinibbio was a few years ago, but I mean, he absolutely torched Neil Magny, kicked his leg to shit, outboxed him easily, and stopped him in the 4th round. Really had barely any trouble with that fight at all. Jeff Neal severely struggled versus Neal at distance, in the clinch, everywhere. So I think that I got to side with Santiago Ponzinibbio here. I think that he did have somewhat concerning performances of his own. Obviously getting sparked by Jing Liang early like that. That was off a 3-year layoff. Jing Liang is a massive puncher, so that deserves a little bit of slack. But the Baeza fight, he got leg kicked early on. His leg looked to be in bad shape. It looked like he was going to lose the fight, but somehow he was able to ignore that leg damage, to keep fighting, to get his own leg kicks going, and to have an absolute barn burner in round 2 and 3. That's my number 1 fight all year. I know we've had a lot of great fights, some great 5-round fights. The fight last night, Jan versus Sandhagen. This is my number 1 fight all year, Ponzinibbio versus Baeza. I mean, that shit is just incredible. The story of the fight, Ponzinibbio losing round 1, coming back to win round 2, having a back and forth round 3, and they literally swing to the absolute bell like Max Holloway, Ricardo Lamas style, with Baez's mouthpiece going flying at the end. I think that Ponzinibbio just showed that he still is a high-level fighter. He's still extremely durable. He still has what it takes to be a high-level fighter at this welterweight weight class in that fight. So at a pick'em at 50-50 odds, I got to go with Ponzinibbio here. Um, what are your thoughts here, Karl?
I'm glad you brought up the Baeza versus Ponzinibbio fight because I think that was absolutely fantastic as well. And I think a lot of people have forgotten just how good Santiago Ponzinibbio was because he obviously had a long break from the sport. I don't know if it was injuries or drug issues or regards or anything like that. But before he had his break, he was on a 7-fight winning streak. And as you mentioned before, destroyed Neal Magny, which was Fight Night Argentina. I think it was in Buenos Aires, I think. And there were people out there saying, hey, this guy is a welterweight dark horse. You could put him against somebody in the top 3 or top 4, and he could give them a run for his money. A lot of that momentum was lost by the long break, and then he had a really rusty performance against the Leech. And I think because of that, I think people have forgotten just how good he actually is. And if you get a Ponzinibbio performing at the same sort of level that he was back in 2017, 2018, you've got yourself a guy who, in my opinion, is deserving of being in the top 10.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think he's definitely top 10. That Baeza fight proved that. And the Baeza is an orthodox striker, so that leg kick is going to be a lot easier to hit when you're fighting orthodox versus orthodox. Jeff Neal's a southpaw. He's not going to be able to target that outside calf as easily. And he's not really a notorious, calf kicker. I think Neal kind of struggles to set up his offense. He swings hard, he punches hard, but in terms of setting up his offense in like a smart, efficient way, I think he kind of lacks knowledge in that. And that's a big trend amongst Fortis MMA fighters. You see like a guy last night, Alonzo Menefield, this huge athletic tank. He just doesn't know how to set up the strikes. He doesn't have that high level of striking. So I think Fortis MMA is more of like a cardio and wrestling camp than it is a high-level striking camp. And I think Jeff Neal has gone a bit underdeveloped in his striking as a result of that.
I would argue that Jeff Neal, I do agree with you, John. I do agree with you that maybe Fortis does have this sort of flaw when it comes to maybe sort of shot selection. But I think that's an issue that's always been brought up with Ponzinibbio as well. Like if you go back and you look at what some of like Ponzinibbio's losses, a lot of the guys who got the better of him, people like Lorenz Larkin, for example, they exploited his lack of shot selection. He'll throw the same combinations over and over throughout a fight. And I think, is Jeff Neal more than capable of trying to do that? I'm not entirely sure, but I hope for Ponzinibbio's perspective, that's a flaw in his game he started ironing out.
Yeah, that is true. And then it should be a striking fight. I'm just trying to imagine any grappling happening. It seems extremely unlikely that any takedowns occur, but I guess I would give Ponzinibbio a little bit more likelihood of hitting a takedown here. But still, I don't think that it's going to happen. The only reason I think it might is because Neal was taken down a few times by Ponzinibbio, by Neal Magny. Magny's a master at working his way into the clinch and getting those takedowns. So I think that's possible. But I hope these guys strike. It should be a fun striking matchup, but I got to go with Ponzinibbio. I think he's higher output, more consistent. He's got a little bit better tools with his jab, his leg kick, better range finders. So I'll be picking Ponzinibbio by decision here.
I will pick Ponzinibbio by decision as well. I do hope, if I had to put my own sort of biased head on here, I was somebody who did buy into the idea of Jeff Neal potentially being a welterweight dark horse. So I would hate the idea of him going 3 losses in a row.
Yeah, I mean, I initially liked the guy a lot too, but I think that he really has hit a wall in terms of his development. So I wouldn't, I think it is just a consequence of his own actions that it's turning out like this. But he did fight on the year-end pay-per-view 2 years ago, and he did knock out Mike Perry in round 1. So he might have some good juju on this card. But you got to think with the DUI, man. I mean, that's bad. I mean, 16 days before a fight, you're getting drunk and drunk driving. I mean, pretty bad sign.
If he's been allowed to compete, though, it's probably picograms.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of crazy that we're even discussing him being able to compete. Right. I mean, if it were the NFL, well, I mean, he probably would have been suspended, 4-6 games or something like that. I mean, I don't think that you have to take him out of the fight right away, but for his own sake, don't you think that he would be like, maybe I should pull out? I don't know. So hopefully the fight stays intact and we didn't just analyze all this shit for nothing.
So we move on to our core main event, and it's the girl who got knocked out by Alexis Davis versus the girl who got submitted by Germaine de Randamie. It's Nunes versus Pena, bantamweight title on the line. Now, you know me, John. I do like my stats, and I've come up with an absolute belter here. When Amanda Nunes steps into the octagon at UFC 269, it will be 729 days between title defenses. Now, that is the longest gap for any belt in UFC history. The second longest was Cain Velasquez, which was 602 days between the third fight with Junior Dos Santos and the match with Fabricio Verdum. Now,
wow.
Exactly. It just goes to show, you know. And anybody who's been following the channel, watches me on these videos, follows me on social media, knows I've been very critical of what's happened to the women's bantamweight division over these past few years. How can the UFC expect fans to be invested in the weight class when the belt's not being defended and the company are making no attempt to try and build new contenders?
Well, like they can't be interested. It's it's kind of like an oxymoron at this point. We've been pretty vocal advocates of all this for a while. I mean, it's she does get a little bit of slack because she did defend the belt in other divisions. But you still got to feel for some of these other bantamweights. I mean, Holly Holm, Rena Aldana, they're kind of just trapped in limbo at 135. Raquel Pennington as well. Avila was on her way up, but now, her progress is kind of halted as well. So there's just not really much going on in that division. And I'm not going to lose any sleep over it. I think it's a really low-level division. I mean, we saw, Aspen Ladd's embarrassing ass. She was number 3 in that division, right? And she just looked, absolutely terrible, missing weight, then fighting and looking absolutely terrible. So, there's just not much to care about at this bantamweight weight class. Not really much to care about this fight either.
I think what makes things worse for a lot of people who are upset about it is we saw what happened with Francis earlier this year. Like, Francis wins the heavyweight title, and 4 months later, the company decide you're not being active enough, and they create the interim belt for Cyril Gane. Yet another one of their champions is allowed to go 2 years without defending a belt, and the UFC haven't done anything about it. And I think you sort of mentioned it before. I think there's a big issue with a lot of the big relevant matches atop the weight class aren't happening. Like, if you look at the sort of top rung of bantamweight fighters, Nunes hasn't fought there for 2 years. Holly 1 year, Germaine 1 year, Aspen 2 years. Like, you can make a big argument the reason Pena's getting this title fight is she's been the only bantamweight fighter who's been trying to stay active, and more than anything, trying to get people to care. Like, say what you want about Juliana. I know there's a lot of fans that don't like her, but she's doing her damnedest to try and sell this fight.
Yeah, I mean, it's all for nothing too. So, I don't give her, too much credit for that. I think it would be more noble of her to just no sell it. Be like, yeah, probably gonna lose. Fight's probably gonna suck. That would be more noble. Vieira probably would have been in her spot if she got that decision over Kunitskaya. Just bad timing for her with the end of that round 3. But yeah, let's get into knocking off this prediction of ours. I mean, it seems obviously a matter of how Nunes will win, how quickly she will win. And, Sarah McMahon was able to take down Pena and out-grapple her for the first 2 rounds of that fight. If she didn't, gas out severely in round 3 and lose in typical Sarah McMahon fashion, it could have been a 30-27 grappling clinic from Sarah McMahon. So you got to think that Nunes should be able to take her down with ease. You should be able to think that Nunes should be able to outstrike her with ease. And it just seems like a matter of how long will Pena last before getting finished. The over in this fight is set at 1.5 rounds, which is as low as it gets, especially in a 5-round fight. So what are you thinking, Karl? You thinking over or under 1.5 rounds?
I think it might go into the second. I think it's going to be one of those situations where most of the damage is done in the first round, and then the job gets done in the second. I wouldn't be surprised as well if we maybe see Nunes trying to do it by submission, because that has been a big Pena weakness. We've seen far weaker grapplers than Nunes be able to finish Pena. So obviously we saw Germaine de Randamie with the guillotine. Shevchenko got an armbar off her back. So I think that maybe that's a big concern. I can see there are people out there who do think that Juliana Pena could cause some problems. And if we have had a look through some of Pena's previous fights, one of the things she is able to do is to make it a dirty, grimy, gritty fight. And we have seen Pena take down fighters who traditionally have very good takedown defense. We've seen her take down Jermaine, who was a far bigger fighter. We've seen her take down Shevchenko. So there is a possibility for Pena, if she is able to survive the onslaught, to maybe turn it into that grimy match. But the flaws she shows in terms of her striking, and especially in terms of how slowly she starts fights, she's never going to be able to get the chance to do it.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of good points there. I mean, you're giving Pena her,
Well, I'm trying to.
some respect. Yeah, and it's I think you brought up as good as points as you can for a fight like this. Pena does typically lose round one, but she does have some good fight in her. Lost round one to Zingano, to Montano, and to McMahon, and was able to come back and win all three of those fights. But she also was winning versus de Randamie, I think, early on, and then went on to lose that fight. So it seems like she really struggles putting together a solid 15 minutes. It seems like she can have a good 2 rounds, but she really has never had a good 3-round performance. Maybe the Jessica Eye fight from way back in the day, but if Pena can get on top, we have seen I don't even know if I would go as far to say we have seen Nunes struggle off her back. I mean, we had way back in the day, but it's hard. She hasn't done anything recently to say that she struggles off her back. So maybe if Pena can get in top position, we can see a situation like the Maia and Shevchenko fight, where maybe Maia gets on top to win 1 round and makes it randomly closer than we expect in 1 round. But ultimately, you got to think Nunes should prevail. You got to think if Nunes gets on top, there's a good chance that Pena doesn't get up, that it's either the round is going to be over or she's going to get finished, because when Pena gets taken down, she really struggles getting off of her back. You can see that in the Montano, the Zingano, and the McMahon fight, all women who are, inferior grapplers to Nunes. So I think it'll probably be 2nd or 3rd round finish for Nunes. So I'll go with the over 1.5 as well. I think Pena can make it 7.5 minutes.
It's a good thing you mentioned there about Nunes being off her back, because you're going to love this. The last person to take down Nunes was Rocky Pennington.
Wow. Well, how much control time did she get off of it? 2 minutes and 13 seconds. That's what they have in the stats for the overall fight. So, maybe that's worth going back and looking to see how she looked off her back. Do you remember what happened once she got taken down?
I think Raquel had taken a lot of damage by that point. I think it was just a case of take her down, and Rocky didn't really. I mean, there was a couple of rabbit shots, stuff like that, but nothing meaningful in terms of massive offense.
One thing I want to bring up that I haven't thought about till now is Nunes' energy at 135 versus 145. She seems a lot more conservative with her energy at 135. Remember the de Randamie fight, arguably gassed out in that 2nd or 3rd round. I mean, she looked extremely tired in that 3rd, 4th, and 5th round, doing the bare minimum, getting those takedowns. And I mean, de Randamie is terrible off of her back, just like Megan Anderson is terrible off of her back. And Nunes, you see against Anderson, going ape shit in round 1, searching for that finish and finding it. Versus de Randamie, she was content to lay and pray for 20 minutes in that fight or something like that, and just do nothing on top. No attempt to finish, no attempt to arm triangle or nothing. So it's really it's a good question. I think it'll either be over in the first 3 minutes, or maybe we actually might get a really long, boring decision from Nunes, which I know you would love to see, to lower her fan appeal even more than it already is. But I think we've discussed this enough. I'll go with Nunes submission round 3.
I'm going to say Nunes submission round 2, but I'm glad you mentioned the difference between 145 and 135, because that's a factor that a lot of people aren't bringing up. This is going to be Nunes' first fight at 135 for 2 years. And I've seen a lot of fighters who have spent a long time in one weight class, try going back down, and in some worst case scenarios, completely lose everything that made them so good. The one that comes to mind for me is Roy Jones. Like, Roy Jones goes up to heavyweight, tries going back down to middleweight, loses all of his speed, his elusiveness, hasn't got the same pop on his shots anymore. Tarver knocks him out in 2 rounds. Now, that's obviously a worst-case scenario. But when you bear that in mind, 2 years away from the division, her weight cuts were always already severe. You go back and you watch the weight cuts at 239, and for the Jermaine fight, she barely made the scales. That's something to maybe bear in mind, that that weight cut could be very, very hard 2 years later as an older fighter who's been away for a bit longer.
Yeah, I mean, you brought up the Roy Jones example, but you can just look at her own career. I mean, she had 2 of her best career performances at 145, knocking out Cyborg, knocking out Holly Holm at 145, and then dropped down to 135 later in the year and looked extremely underwhelming. Arguably, her worst performance in 6, 7, 8 years. That fight against Durand, just awful. I mean, they should erase that fight from UFC Fight Pass history.
I am going to make a bit of a bold prediction, though. And I want to know if you think that there's maybe some sort of method in my madness, as it were. I'm going to make a bold prediction. Nunes is going to win this fight. There's no question about that. But during the post-fight interview with Joe Rogan, she takes the gloves off and leaves him in the center of the cage.
I can see it. I can see it. And, you know, I would honestly respect her more than I have for the past few years if she decided to do that. She has really little left to or nothing left to prove, really. I mean, what is there left for her? Ketlin Vieira? Really? That's it. Ketlin Vieira and Irina Aldana are the only, you know, respectable women that she hasn't beat. I mean, I don't think that she has to stick around to fight those two. She, you know, has a daughter now. It seems like her wife, Nina, might be done fighting as well. She had a pretty bad showing.
Against Mackenzie Dern.
Has Nina got another fight announced yet?
She was supposed to fight...
Yeah, no, but has she announced another fight?
She was supposed to fight Lemos on the end of year card, but that got pulled out. Angie Hill's taking a place.
Ooh. Yeah, she should retire too, Nina. They should both retire, sail off into the sunset. I'm sure Nunes has got a few million in the bank. And yeah, that's a good prediction. I like it. I won't say I agree because I don't want to steal your thunder, but I like the idea.
And one more thing before we end this, I want you to finish off this line. If Juliana Pena wins this fight, I will... ...
care about women's mixed martial arts less than ever.
I'll add my own here, and
people better hope that doesn't happen.
I'm gonna actually post this on Facebook and on Twitter. If Juliana Pena wins this fight, and I want to stress, I don't think Pena will, I will buy a Juliana Pena t-shirt, and I will wear it for the UFC 270 preview show.
And I think you should do a shoey too. if Tai Tuivasa and Juliana Pena win, we're both doing shoeys on the next preview show. Okay.
Done deal.
I agree. There we go.
It's time for us to talk about our main event here, and we are going to one of the marquee divisions in the UFC. It is the lightweight division, and it is the first title defense for probably one of the most surprising champions in the division's history, Charles Oliveira. He's going to be taking on, though, a guy who many people believe is already the best lightweight in the world, Dustin Poirier. And I think it's been very interesting to see how people have sort of treated Charles Oliveira in these sort of 6 or 7 months since he won the belt, because I mean no disrespect to Charles Oliveira, because I think he's a fantastic fighter. The growth he's made over the past 4 or 5 years has been fantastic. But there are a lot of people out there who, rather unfairly, don't see him as a legitimate champion. And I think that's maybe because he never fought the Justin Gaethjes, the Dustin Poiriers of the world. There was the Michael Chandler fight, which he won, which he did struggle before he managed to get the win. And I think it's maybe a bit unfair that some of the treatment, like people are almost treating this as if it's already a cakewalk for Dustin Poirier. Charles Oliveira is a live dog in this fight.
Yeah, I'm definitely not treating it like a cakewalk at all. I mean, it's an extremely competitive matchup. But I do think that it is fair to say that Poirier is the more legitimate champion of the two. I think that Oliveira getting that path to the title, especially in retrospect. I mean, especially I'm in retrospect with how shot Tony Ferguson has looked, with how maybe fringe top five Chandler has looked. I don't think Oliveira being, the undisputed champion is too legitimate, but you still got to give him credit. I mean, he was, kind of almost a journeyman flyweight or a featherweight for a few years, reinvented himself at this lightweight weight class. Took one loss, but went on a crazy streak, a lot of finishes. And obviously has reinvented himself, improved his striking massively. He had been known for kind of wilting and quitting in a few fights. We've seen him come back a few times. Got poked in the eye versus Tamer, came back and won. Got dropped early versus Chandler, came back and won. So Oliveira, I mean, is reinventing himself at this lightweight weight class. And I think his stock has honestly rose since he gained the title. I mean, I don't know if he speaks English himself or he has somebody translating his tweets, but he tweets out funny shit all the time. So you gotta love both these guys, both great fighters, both great guys outside the cage. And this is just an A+ elite level fight. It doesn't get any better than this in MMA.
What do you think is the big changes that Charles Oliveira's made that's turned him from that sort of action fighter, always getting the submissions, to being a champion?
Well, I think it has a lot to do with his strength of schedule. I do think that. I think that if you look at his wins in that win streak, he has like a plethora of like B tier wins. Guida and Miller and Tamer, Jared Gordon, Kevin Lee. These are good fighters, but they're not really close to top 15, top 10. I mean, he really, Lee was top 10 at the time. Ferguson was, but not actually. And so is Chandler. He really has 3 top 10 wins out of those 8 wins. So I think obviously not cutting the weight is big for him. He, used to really deplete himself getting down to 145. And I think that kind of contributed to a few of the times that he wilted in fights. But now not having to cut weight, I think that there's just clear improvements in his striking technique. I think he must have gotten with a new striking coach at some point over the past 3 or 4 years. And, he's got that, Thai style of striking, mixes in knees, kicks, elbows, punches really well. His boxing has gotten better. So I think that it's A, the weight cut, and B, his improvements in his striking, honestly, not being completely reliant on that grappling. He still is an A+ grappler, still has those submissions in MMA history or UFC history. I doubt anyone will ever beat that, right? But he's not completely reliant on that grappling. He has the striking to go along with it now.
I think he's a lot more composed than he used to be. And I think that there was once upon a time where Charles Oliveira, because he didn't have the confidence in his striking that he does now, there was this urgency to get a fight to the ground as quickly as he could. This time around, though, he's a lot more patient. He's a lot more happy to strike. And I think especially his kick game is something which has made a lot of improvements, because he's a long guy for lightweight. And he's got I think got a pretty decent kick on him. And we see it as well. There was often a time where Charles Oliveira, he would often crumble when he had a lot of pressure and he faced a lot of adversity. I think that's something which has changed as well. We saw that against Chandler. Like, there were plenty of times when Michael Chandler was on the verge of winning the fight, but Charles Oliveira was able to ride it out and then got the finish right at the start of the second round.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned that earlier. It seems like his toughness, his resilience has leveled up a little bit. I mean, if you go back and watch that Tamer, I mean, I think both of Tamer's fingers go right into his eyes. I mean, his eyes are bright red. He's like crying, tearing up, like can barely see. I was for sure thinking that he was gonna, take the no contest, take the DQ or whatever. He kept fighting and he submitted Tamer just a few minutes later. So I think that his durability is still a concern. You saw the way he got dropped by that punch versus Chandler. It's just he does have that mental fight in him now to recover and to fight back. So he's definitely improved in that area.
And I think mental toughness as well is something which has really been you could see it a lot in Dustin Poirier as well. Like, I'm going to read some of Dustin Poirier's wins over his past couple of years. Conor McGregor twice, Justin Gaethje, Eddie Alvarez, Anthony Pettis, Max Holloway twice. This is like a who's who of some of the best sort of middle-class fighters, lightweight, featherweight, that you can come across. Like, we've got a guy here who is on the verge of being a UFC Hall of Famer. And if he gets this lightweight belt, he's all but locked his place in my opinion.
Yeah, I think he, it's hard to put, I don't put too much credence into the Hall of Fame, but I mean, I think he's pretty much already at that level. Wins over McGregor, Hooker, Holloway, Alvarez, and Gaethje is just incredible. I mean, those that could be half of the best lightweights of the past 10 years. And Poirier has beat them all decisively. This is just such an amazing matchup. It really is hard to pick who you are going to, there's who you want to win, who you think is going to win. And I definitely want Poirier to win. But because I want him to win, I'm giving even more of a chance to Charles Oliveira because, getting down to the matchup, it should be a striker versus grappler matchup, right? I mean, Oliveira is going to be able to hang at times on the feet with Poirier, but you got to think the longer the fight stays on the feet, the prolonged striking exchanges, especially later in the fight where Poirier is much more experienced, you got to think that favors the better boxer, the better striker in Dustin Poirier. He's also much more durable as well. We've seen Poirier eat, tons and tons of damage and, not even get wobbled, not even get dropped. And we've seen Oliveira get dropped with, some glancing type of punches. And then the striking, I'd say, is about 70-30 for Poirier, right? 70% of the exchanges should be going Poirier's way. The grappling, on the other hand, is probably, 90-10 for Oliveira. So you got to think that Oliveira is going to be wanting to get this fight to the floor. He's going to be looking to wrestle here pretty urgently. And the fight really comes down to how urgently Oliveira wrestles. Because in some fights of his, we've seen him wrestle right away, hit takedowns, and show his immaculate top game. Some fights we've seen him strike a little bit, maybe look to mix in the wrestling later. I don't think he can strike first versus Poirier. I think he really needs to get off wrestling early, and I think he likely needs to get a takedown to translate it into a finish in the first round or two, because after that, I think the round 3, 4, and 5 experience really favors Dustin Poirier. I mean, Poirier has been scheduled for 5 rounds for what is it? I'm looking at 8 fights in a row here, I think.
Yeah, I think
he's gone the full 5 rounds against Holloway.
I think Dustin Poirier's last 3-round fight,
UFC 211.
Yes, the Eddie Alvarez fight
was Alvarez. Yeah. So he's gone. He knocked out Gaethje in round 4. He beat Holloway over 5 rounds. He withstood the early storm from Dan Hooker in rounds 1 and 2 and came back in 3, 4, 5. Poirier is used to rounds 3, 4, and 5. He can go that full 25 minutes. He's just a lot more familiar with his cardio. So you got to think, if it gets out of round 2, it's probably favoring Dustin Poirier at that point. But I'm still not discounting Charles Oliveira finding a finish in rounds 1 and 2 because Oliveira's wrestling is good. His top game is great. His submissions are great. And he really could finish Dustin Poirier in the early rounds here because Poirier has struggled defensive grappling-wise. He, obviously was defeated. And I don't think he fought to his highest potential versus Khabib. He panicked a bit at times. He felt the pressure. He made a few mistakes because he was frustrated. And I think he will be a bit better prepared for the grappling here versus Oliveira. What I really look at for this fight is who the guys that he's been training with. He's been training with Mateusz Garbrandt, Mosvar Evelev, like some real high-level grapplers up at ATT that are going to help him get prepared for this fight. So I've been talking for a bit. I'll pass it back to you, Karl. What are you thinking about the matchup?
I'm glad you mentioned Garbrandt there because Garbrandt is a hell of a good jiu-jitsu guy. So I think if there's somebody who you want to replicate the game of Charles Oliveira, I think Garbrandt is one of your best choices. I'm very similar to you. I think we're going to see Charles Oliveira much more eager to go to the ground than he did against Michael Chandler. So I can see the takedowns trying to come thick and early. I do share some of the concerns in terms of Dustin's takedown defense. And I also think Dustin can maybe sometimes be a little bit porous with his striking. Like, I go back to the Dan Hooker fight. He ate a lot of big shots against Dan Hooker, who was another similarly long-framed lightweight fighter, much in the same way of Charles Oliveira. But Charles Oliveira has a very long frame, and I can see Dustin Poirier hammering that body. And I think it could be one of those situations where he takes those sort of big shots, and then come the 4th and 5th rounds, the damage becomes too much, and Dustin Poirier gets the win.
Yeah, I like that prediction. Looking at the odds here, Poirier minus 163. That's about 63%. I think it's about right. I think Poirier should be the deserved favorite here. I give him the cardio edge, the durability edge, the boxing edge. He really just has to defend the takedowns. I don't think he's gonna defend the takedowns. I don't think he's going to stuff the shots straight out. He's going to get taken down initially, and then he needs to, safely work back to his feet, not let Oliveira get a hold of his neck, not give up his back to Oliveira, because he's not going to have that same explosive athleticism as Michael Chandler to be able to explode out of that back take. But we have seen Oliveira get the takedowns on guys, get submission attempts, seem to have good advantage positions, not be able to finish them, and then, he wilted, then he got knocked out. The Paul Felder fight is the one I'm talking about, his most recent loss. He took down Felder. He had Felder in some good submission attempts. Felder not a particularly great grappler, and he was able to just gut out those submission attempts, not get stopped, and started hammering away on Oliveira there. So I think it's going to be really sweaty. I mean, I'm definitely not betting Dustin Poirier here. I love the guy. I'm not going to be betting him because I think rounds 1 and 2, I mean, there's a real grappling threat that we have to be aware of. And, as a big Dustin Poirier fan, I'm kind of prepared for him to lose. I am. I think that, I don't know, I'm just getting vibes that Oliveira is going to take him down. I'm getting vibes that, Poirier hasn't quite fixed up all those holes in his grappling defense from the Khabib fight. We saw him get taken down and mounted by Eddie Alvarez a few years back as well. And I just think that if Oliveira gets his right fight with the grappling, I think he really could pull off a finish in the early rounds here with a submission likely over Poirier. So if I'm betting Oliveira, I would probably take him by rounds 1, 2, and 3 finish. Maybe Charles sub round 1, sub round 2, and then maybe look to live bet Poirier after to see how he's doing with the takedowns. So gun to my head pick, I'm going Dustin Poirier, likely knockout in round 3 or 4.
At the moment, the INC poll has this 60-40 in favour of Dustin, which I think is pretty much the same way I'm leaning as well. I am going to pick Dustin Poirier to win this one. I'm going to say 4th round stoppage, but I'm in a very similar boat to you as well. Charles Oliveira is a very live dog in this fight. There is a big possibility of him getting that early submission, which I think is the way, if Oliveira is going to win this fight, that's how it's going to happen. And if Charles Oliveira does win this fight, bearing in mind what Dustin Poirier has done this year, bearing in mind that he's the A side going into this pay-per-view, what does that do to the perception of Charles Oliveira?
I think it drops it a little bit. But he is the underdog fight. People know that Poirier is a tough matchup for him. You're going to hear some idiots call him, a paper champ, all this bullshit. I mean, there's no need to insult the man. I mean, I would never, I question the legitimacy of his belt. I'm not going to sit there and call him a paper champ and tweet at him and, insult him or whatnot. I mean, it's not his fucking fault the UFC decided to make that fight for the undisputed lightweight championship. He won the fight. It's his belt. And, I think he'll still be around for a long time without, even if he loses this fight, he's not going anywhere. I'm sure he'll bounce back. I would love to see him fight Beneil Dariush, Islam Makhachev. I mean, those are real fun matchups, and he's going nowhere. So, Oliveira, I think, could still have a good 3 or 4 years left in his career after this.
And I think I'm glad you mentioned that about Charles Oliveira, because in my opinion, any fighter who becomes UFC champion has to deserve it in some way. They have to have done something and have some kind of talent. There aren't people who are just given belts. They've got to do something to earn it. Even if you're
Nico,
a Nico Montano or a Dave Mene or someone of that sort of ilk, they still had some good qualities to warrant getting the belt anyway. So, and I think Charles Oliveira's in that boat. I mean, the guy was on a 9-fight winning streak. You can't be a bad fighter and be on a 9-fight winning streak in the UFC.
No. I mean, yeah, he's terrific. And this is, like I said, A+ versus A+, elite level matchup. In these fights, they're extremely competitive. And what we have been saying, the last thing I'll say, though, is I think like 9 of the past 10 main events have gone the distance. A lot of those fights have been favored to end inside the distance. A lot of those fights have had crazy moments where you think it's going to finish, crazy back and forth wars like Aldo and Vettori and
Light versus Dumont
and Costa. But 9 out of the past 10. Yeah, 9 out of the past. Yeah, crazy war in that one. But we're seeing a lot of main events go the distance lately, so we're kind of on a trend for that. Even though this one is extremely likely to end inside the distance, the odds have it at like minus 550 to go inside the distance. So that's 85% to end by finish. So it would be crazy to see this one go cards.
And that is all the time that we have for the UFC 269 preview show. Probably one of the longest shows that we've actually done, John, which I think it's a sign of how good this card's been, that we just got ourselves so engrossed in these main card matchups and the potential ramifications of them. I'm really looking forward to the card, and I'm sure you are as well.
Hell yeah, man. I mean, it's deserved to be one of the longest shows because this is a 7-fight main card pay-per-view, in my opinion. I mean, don't let it fool you that Emmett, Ige, Cruz, Munoz are on the prelims. Those are elite level fights. So really looking forward to this card. Incredible matchups, and I've enjoyed discussing it with my man Karl as always. So thank you to the INC listeners. You can find me at Martian MMA on YouTube, SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. I talk about the betting odds for every single UFC fight, and you can follow me at UFO_UFC on Twitter. And thanks to Karl for having me on again. We'll see you before the next UFC 270 pay-per-view.
And that'll be the first card of 2022 because we're going to be taking a month-long break. We're going to be enjoying New Year, Christmas. Any plans to bring in the New Year to celebrate the 25th?
No, I might have to reinvent my personality during that 3-week break with no UFC. I don't know what I'm going to be doing with myself. I might take up like crocheting or knitting or something like that to keep me occupied.
I really got into horse racing during lockdown.
Betting on them? Or just watching them?
No, just watching old horse races.
If you're betting on them, I can get with it.
Well, I would bet on the old ones because I know who wins.
Put it on at a bar or something and be like, hey buddy, you want to make a bet? I'll take number 7.
Yeah, so thank you very much for joining us, John. It has been an absolute pleasure once again for you to join us. And we've done a full 12 months of preview shows, which is the first time that we've done this on the INC sort of franchise, which a big thank you to you because you certainly bring out the motivation in me to continue doing these shows. I want to say a big thank you as well to everybody who's been tuning in over the past 12 months. We've been growing up to, I think, nearly 300 subscribers since we started the INC live channel, which I want to say a big thank you to everyone who's been supporting us, providing any sort of feedback in regards to fighter interviews, in regards to the recaps, the preview shows, of course. And 2022, we hope to continue this trend. We've got ourselves another interview coming out on Friday, so stay tuned to that one. For now, though, this has been the UFC 269 preview show. My name's been Karl Bainbridge. That's been John Martian. And we'll see you again in...
see you guys later.
We'll see you again in about 29, 28 days' time, where we'll be talking about one of the biggest heavyweight fights of recent years, Francis Ngannou versus Ciryl Gane, UFC 270. This is the INC. Thank you for watching.